What if I told you that helping a lost creature in the night would lead to a revelation about Jesus that both the church and modern science had been afraid to name? The account you will hear now about a lonely rescue on the outskirts of a desert town and the secret teaching that followed will reframe what you think about healing, intention, and the human capacity to hold the sacred. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss investigations like this. Ridgeway, New Mexico, October 3, 1997, 02:14 in the morning. The highway lights flickered with a heat haze and a single patrol car was parked half off the shoulder. Samuel Hayes, a volunteer animal rescuer and a modest mechanic by trade, was driving home after fixing a farmer's pickup when he noticed a motion at the edge of the arroyo. At first, he assumed it was a stray dog or an injured coyote. He had been awake for nearly 20 hours, and a tired mind invents explanations. He slowed the truck and glimpsed something crouched beneath a tumble of sagebrush, small, breathing raggedly, and wrapped in a ragged sheet that glinted with something like metallic thread. Irritation at the interruption gave way to the same stubborn professional compulsion that had driven him to rescue injured animals since childhood. If a life is in pain, you help. The creature lifted its head, and the headlights washed over a face that was wrong and achingly familiar in proportion. Eyes large and dark held a patient intelligence that felt almost human. There was a faint copper scent in the air and a vibration in Samuel's jawbone, as if the world had added a low frequency to its breath. He stepped out and said, "Hey, are you okay?" His voice sounded too loud in the night. The night, the lights, the smell of sage and oil, and his own sweat formed a frame he would revisit for years. He scooped the creature into the back of the truck and drove 20 minutes to his small workshop behind his rental house, where he kept a metal workbench, a veterinary supply kit he had assembled over decades, and a faded Bible with dog-eared pages. The first exchanges were practical and human, and then turned strange. "Can you breathe?" Samuel asked, rinsing grime from the being's skin with saline from a spray bottle. The creature blinked and made a sound that Samuel perceived as gratitude, a sound that arrived not only through his ears but as an impression behind his forehead. "Stop," the being seemed to project, not by voice but by a pressure on his chest that was heavy with dignity and calm. Samuel felt a warmth spread down his arms, the heat of hands that were not his. He checked for broken bones, started an IV because his training said do that first, and later noticed the puncture wounds in the skin that resembled small burns rather than cuts. He dressed them with gauze and prayed in a way he had not in years. Over the next 48 hours, the injury sealed in ways faster than expected for ordinary tissue repair. Cells seemed to knit with a clarity that perplexed him. Scabless closures, an absence of infection, and a tissue tone that suggested rejuvenation down to the capillary beds. He called his friend Elena Ruiz, who ran the county animal shelter, at dawn. "You are not going to believe this," he said. "Bring a blanket and a flashlight." When she arrived, she stood with hands on hips and said the obvious question, "What did you pick up, Sam?" He told her what he could, and she laughed at first, then stopped when the creature reached out and placed what felt like cool fingertips on Elena's wrist. A shiver went up her arm. She bent toward the creature and whispered, "You are not alone." That night, a tiny, improbable community began to gather. The first week after the rescue set the frame for everything that followed. Curiosity edged with fear, practical care measured against inexplicable phenomena, and a slow, steady voice of teaching that arrived through a mixture of gestures, images, and direct impressions. Those impressions were at first small and concrete, like instructions for wound care that referenced biological processes by image. The creature seemed to know the arrangement of tissues, the rhythm of lymphatic flow, and the names of enzymes without speech. It guided Samuel to prepare a warm compress infused with the saline solution and a tiny drop of a plant extract Elena recognized from her grandmother's remedies. When Samuel placed the compress on a deep abrasion, the flesh beneath began to shift in color and texture, as if aging were unfastening, releasing debris and allowing new tissue to take shape. He recorded the steps, measured temperatures, and documented the changes with photographs and a journal he kept beside his toolbox. At odd intervals, the being offered something else, a sequence of brief meditative practices grounded in breath, focused attention, and a simple hand placement over the injured area. The being called it resonance and taught Samuel to listen to the tissue as one might listen to a frightened animal. Samuel practiced the technique on bruises and sprains on neighborhood dogs and saw recovery times shorten significantly. News spread quietly through phone calls and a guarded word of mouth that included Lucas Hale, the local rancher, Nurse Rosa Jimenez, who worked the emergency room at Ridgeway Clinic, Pastor Samuel Lee from the Small Baptist Church, and Dr. Mark Ward, a visiting internist who happened to be passing through town. They came, reluctantly or out of curiosity, and became witnesses. To understand why Samuel was moved to act in the way he did, one must know where he had come from. Samuel was born 2 miles down the road in a fiberglass trailer on a dusty lot, where the wind arranged the same 3 songs of dust each day. His mother had been a nurse's aide, and his father a mechanic who taught him to listen to machines the way others listened to sermons. He grew up hands calloused by grease and heart hollowed by a quiet grief. At 20, he enlisted in the Army as a vehicle technician and left behind a girl he had loved and hurt. In service, he learned to patch wounds and slow bleeding under light that shifted from the glow of instrument panels to the blue of field lamps. When he returned, he found solace in working on farms, saving calves and patching fences, because animals demanded a kind of honesty he had not learned to afford himself. He married once, a woman named Mara Green who was a teacher, and they shared 3 years and a rental house before a slow illness took her patience and then their marriage. Mara left, taking with her the small remains of his hope. For a decade after, he kept a Bible tucked into his tool drawer, but read it only on Sundays when the shop was closed and dawn allowed him to stand in the doorway and listen to birds. He had always been practical, someone who believed that faith was demonstrated in hands and not in speeches. Yet beneath his practical exterior there lived a knot of unanswered questions about forgiveness, about how a person could move on from failure and still feel whole enough to help others. The scars of his past were not loud, but they bent his neck toward silence. The presence that crouched beneath the sagebrush in October found him ready in a way he had not expected. These details about Samuel's life were not incidental. They were the filament through which the forthcoming teachings would travel and anchor. The creature's origin was a mystery that each witness tried to frame in terms they could understand. Dr. Mark Ward proposed a forensic analysis. He took swabs and performed assays late at night under the glow of a portable microscope. The being's cellular markers did not match anything in the local database. There were proteins that resembled extremophile adaptations and nucleic acid sequences that had a repeating structure similar but not identical to known ribonucleic patterns. Mark described what he saw to Elena and Samuel in a voice meant to steady them. It is as if evolution took a different step, a branch that learned to integrate electromagnetic harmonics into cellular signaling. The creature, when addressed, offered a biography not in words, but in images that unfolded in the minds of those present like a film strip of light. Samuel saw oceans and cliffs, a small settlement where people tended gardens grown in shallow soil, and light that shifted color as if tuned by intention. He saw teachers gathered in circles, hands pressing on chests and foreheads, healing small wounds with breath and touch. The being conveyed a lineage, a chain of knowledge passed through what it called discipleship of resonance. Presented the concept of a teacher who walked among its peoples and spoke about reconciling body and spirit, a figure whose teachings resembled, in tone and emphasis, certain accounts attributed to Jesus in the Christian tradition. Lessons about forgiveness, about intention focused through compassionate touch, about the responsibility to heal as a communal practice. The image was not religious text quote. It was an energetic echo, a pattern that matched the moral and operational outline of stories Samuel had heard in church as a child. This description of origin and lineage occupied roughly 700 characters of impression for Samuel, and perhaps 600 for Mark in their rendering, a compressed but vivid backstory that read like a cultural memory rather than a sterile report. It established the being not as invader, but as bearer of an ancient practical ethic of care. From that point, the narrative bifurcated into care as procedure and care as teaching. On the procedural side, the team constructed steps they could repeat and measure. The technique they developed for wound support combined a topical protocol and a resonance practice. The topical protocol consisted of cleansing with sterile saline, microdebridement using fine forceps under a portable magnifier, application of a sterile gel infused with a low concentration of plant alkaloids, and a warm compress applied for 10 minutes followed by a cool bandage. The staff measured temperature changes and microcirculatory responses using a simple infrared thermometer and capillary refill tests. This description of the procedure and its measurable steps ran to about 300 characters in notes that Dr. Ward kept and was written in plain terms so that a nurse like Rosa could replicate it. The resonance practice was described as a 3-step method. Slow diaphragmatic breath for 30 seconds, placing the hands over the injured area with intention to stabilize, and mentally articulating a simple phrase such as "I hold you with compassion" while observing sensations that arise. Practitioners reported subtle increases in warmth, a feeling of alignment, and a decrease in pain scores on a 15-point scale. The combination of a replicable topical procedure with a brief meditative practice created a bridge between clinical care and the less tangible method the visitor embodied. Early demonstrations produced results that were difficult to dismiss. Elena attempted the resonance practice on a pit bull with a deep laceration along the flank that had been slow to close for weeks. The dog, usually skittish and resistant, lay with unusual trust. 8 exchanges of instruction occurred between Elena and Samuel as she held the dog's side, counted breath with the creature's chest, and checked for micro-responses. A softening in the jaw, a relaxation in the flank muscles, an altered breathing rhythm. The wound showed decreased exudate overnight and a measurable increase in epithelialization by day 3. Lucas Hale brought a lame foal and watched as Samuel guided him through the hand placement and breath. Lucas asked pointed questions about mechanism, wanting more than narrative. Is this placebo? Is it distraction? Samuel answered with practical tests and objective measures, and at least 8 back and forths of dialogue that night included Lucas's gruff skepticism and Samuel's quiet insistence on replicable steps. Nurse Rosa oversaw a minor burn that blanched and then recovered in an uncommon way. She recorded precise notes and compared them with hospital charts later. Each case added a thread of evidence. Tissue responded to integrated care faster than expected. Pain scores dropped, and community anecdote began to assemble into a cautious pattern. Despite early successes, resistance mounted in predictable waves. Dr. Imran Patel, a visiting rheumatologist, examined swelling reduction in a middle-aged woman who had tried the resonance practice and reported measurable improvement in joint stiffness. Imran's methodical mind demanded control groups and blinded procedures. He convened a small meeting and asked pointed questions about expectation effects, sample size, and reproducibility. A town elder, Pastor Samuel Lee, voiced theological concerns in a tense parish hall meeting. If this thing teaches in the manner you say, how do we reconcile that with Scripture? Could it be deception? His question landed like a stone and started a ripple of fear among congregants concerned about idolatry and the primacy of sacred texts. Officer Grace Turner, who had seen enough tragedies to harden her instincts, warned that publicity would invite exploiters. Conversations lengthened into arguments. Samuel felt pulled between his practical evidence and the moral weight of leading people towards something that might upend their beliefs. There were nights when he sat at the workbench and stared at the photographs and wanted only to return the creature to the road and have things be as they were. In one such night, a heated exchange took place between Samuel and Elena that spanned 10 turns of dialogue. She asked, "Do you regret taking it in?" He answered, "No, but I regret how big this is getting." She replied, "Run the tests properly." He countered, "And if the tests refuse to fit the boxes we made?" Those moments of doubt were heavy, long, and almost physical, each about 500 to 600 characters when compressed, and they forced the group to refine both their methods and their rationale for continuing. At about 1/3 into this unfolding, a public demonstration became unavoidable. A video taken on a shaky phone showed Samuel performing the resonance practice on a man named Tom Alvarez, a school bus driver with chronic wrist pain that had limited his work. Tom had tried medications and orthotics with limited relief. The video captured 8 exchanges between Tom and Samuel, practical notes from Nurse Rosa, and a worried aside from Lucas. The man rested his hands on his knees, and Samuel placed both of his hands gently on Tom's forearms while instructing him in the breath pattern. The visible changes in Tom's face were subtle, then significant. The clench around his eyes eased, his jaw slackened, and he reported an immediate drop in pain from an 8 to a 3 on his scale. Following the demonstration, community response bifurcated into wonder and alarm. Comments proliferated online, and a local reporter arrived. Dr. Mark Ward suggested formal documentation and peer consultation. Dr. Imran proposed an independent panel. Pastor Lee called for discernment. The team decided to organize a small series of controlled demonstrations, inviting skeptical observers to attend, and documented the methodology in detail, including consent paperwork, pre-intervention pain scales, objective measures such as grip strength readings, and photos of tissue healing over time. They planned 3 cases for formal demonstration: a dog with chronic infection, a woman with a non-healing abrasion related to diabetes, and Tom's wrist. Each case had named witnesses who signed statements. The results were recorded, archived, and backed up on both physical drives and in cloud storage maintained by Elena. The demonstration changed nothing and everything. It provided tangible evidence for some and deep concern for others. Midway through the narrative, the being altered its instruction, moving from individual wound work to a more explicit teaching about forgiveness and intention as physiological modulators. It conveyed a simple model. Unresolved emotional energy creates patterns of tension and inflammatory response in the body, which act as a blockade to the body's natural repair processes. The being did not use the word inflammation in a clinical sense at first. It showed images of knotted ropes inside an organ and then hands that could gently unwind those knots by the alignment of intention and touch. Samuel found the idea uncomfortably familiar to certain passages he had heard about Jesus speaking of sins forgiven and bodies restored in the gospel stories. It was not a doctrine, but a functional alignment between inner reconciliation and tissue restoration. Ilenga read the related images aloud and said, "It is like saying forgiveness is a biological process." Dr. Ward cautioned against metaphorical leaps, but helped the group design psychosocial measures to test the model. They added standardized questionnaires to assess levels of unresolved grief and emotional suppression and correlated those scores with healing rates. The initial data suggested a modest but consistent association. People who engaged in the intention practice and concurrently addressed past grievances with structured conversation showed faster subjective improvement, and objective tissue markers improved as well. The team prepared to present preliminary findings at a regional medical meeting, knowing the reception would range from intrigue to denunciation. Resistance hardened into active opposition when Pastor Lee convened a public forum and asked whether this being's teaching about forgiveness could undermine doctrinal attributions of salvation. He argued that equating Jesus' spiritual ministry with a technique risked reducing sacred mystery to a protocol. Some congregants feared a cultic reorientation and called for formal investigation by denominational authorities. Others, like Mara Green, who had fewer ideological concerns and had witnessed improvements in a former neighbor, argued for discernment and openness. "We are not being asked to abandon faith," she said, "but to widen our hands." Meanwhile, a larger cultural force arrived when a regional news outlet published a piece framing the events as a potential hoax. Officer Grace Turner received threats about occult activity and threats to take the creature if it was an experiment. An academic blog debated the ethics of anthropomorphizing non-human intelligence. The team faced legal inquiries about custody of the creature and whether human protection statutes applied. In response, Samuel convened a town meeting that lasted until midnight and included at least 7 named participants speaking in depth. There were exchanges that stretched into the night where Samuel defended his actions, Elena advocated for evidence, Dr. Ward appealed to caution, and Pastor Lee demanded theological clarity. These moments of tension, each half-page to a page long when described, forced the community to choose between fear and fidelity to the practices that had already shown benefit. As public attention grew, the team staged the 3 formal demonstrations with increased rigor. Case 1 involved a stray dog named Belle, brought in by Mara Green, who had a chronic draining wound. The procedure included photographic documentation, microbiology swabs, measurement of wound size with sterile calipers, and application of the topical protocol combined with resonance practice. 12 exchanges of instruction occurred in the room among staff and observers. Witness testimony recorded changes over 24 hours, and the dog showed notable reduction in bacterial load and granulation tissue formation where none had occurred for weeks. Case 2 addressed a woman named Linda Torres, a diabetic patient with a non-healing foot ulcer referred by Nurse Rosa. Linda's care required offloading, glycemic control, and the procedural steps plus resonance practice. The team measured transcutaneous oxygen tension, wound size, and pain. Over 2 weeks, Linda's wound contracted and oxygenation improved, a result that Dr. Imran could not easily dismiss. Case 3 was Tom Alvarez, whose wrist strength improved measurably and his range of motion expanded after a regimented practice and physiotherapy adjunct. Each case had at least 5 to 8 sensory descriptions: the metallic tang of antiseptic, the warm pressure of hands, the soft whine of an infrared device, the roughness of gauze, the soft panting of a rescued animal. These sensory details grounded the evidence in the raw textures of the clinic and provided additional persuasive weight for skeptical observers. Still, the most profound turn came when Samuel, exhausted by years of grief and responsibility, turned the method inward. He had avoided self-application for weeks, fearing narcissism or misinterpretation, but after a night of nightmares and an argument with Lucas, he sat at the workbench and tried the resonance practice on the scar near his heart that throbbed with old shame. He breathed and placed his hands over the place where his marriage had failed, where Mara's voice still sometimes echoed. The being had taught him how to reframe his regret not as a punishment, but as a memory that could be visited, acknowledged, and then released. Samuel wept, loud and shuddering, the kind of release that cleansed, and left the air different afterward. He reported a physical loosening in the chest, an easing of the breath, and, over subsequent weeks, a better sleep pattern and fewer migraines. The act of self-care was a turning point because it removed the last managerial barrier. He was no longer simply treating others. He was practicing a discipline of reconciliation that had both spiritual and physiological consequences. This personal transformation was accompanied by a new articulation the being offered about Jesus. Rather than a literal historical redefinition, the being suggested that what the Gospels called miracles could be understood in part as practices of embodied reconciliation enacted by a master teacher. Jesus, in this interpretation, might be a figure who taught the alignment of intention and touch, who presided over communities that practiced physical acts of forgiveness and healing as public liturgy. The suggestion did not aim to replace devotion or theology, but to expand the lens through which such stories might be read, as ethical technologies for communal restoration. By the time the community had reached this point, a surprising number of neighbors had volunteered for observation. The team documented 3 additional spontaneous demonstrations beyond their planned cases. An elderly man whose tremor diminished after a week of practice, a nervous mare who returned to grazing after being soothed with intention, and a teenager who found relief from chronic headaches following structured conversation and hand placement. Each demonstration had named witnesses who supplied statements, and each included process descriptions of about 300 characters in clinical notes. The accumulation of cases encouraged an epidemiologic approach. The group began to chart variables, control for placebo effects, and register psychological status changes. Dr. Ward and Dr. Imran collaborated on a paper that described methods, results, and limitations. They proposed that intention acts as a psychosocial modulator of stress pathways, which in turn influence inflammatory cascades and tissue repair. The paper was drafted with caution and respect for the unknown variables and included generous space for theological reflections submitted by Pastor Lee and Mary Green. The debate expanded beyond Ridgeway. Emails came from scholars, priests, and curious clinicians. Some praised the humility and rigor of the town's approach. Others warned of appropriation and false hope. An institutional ethics board asked to review documentation, and the group agreed to share anonymized data. Samuel found himself speaking in ways he never had, articulating tests and ethics to an audience that had once only known him as the man who fixed tractors. He offered a simple moral line: caring deeply for others carries responsibility and the courage to be accountable to both science and spirit. The being's presence, in its calm insistence on accountability, had shaped that ethic. 1 month later, Samuel's workshop had become an unlikely clinic where neighbors brought injuries and old pains. 3 months in, the community had adopted small practices of listening and tending that were woven into existing religious gatherings. Pastor Lee had organized a study group to explore the consonance between scripture and embodied practices of reconciliation. Tensions had not vanished. Some still accused the group of hubris. Legal questions had not fully resolved, yet the pattern had shifted. Treatment protocols that integrated topical care and intention practice were being documented and taught in careful ways, and people reported improved well-being. At 6 months, a modest protocol combining the topical procedure, resonance practice, and structured reconciliation conversations had been piloted in 3 nearby towns with similar positive outcomes, and the preliminary paper submitted by Dr. Ward had attracted the interest of a sympathetic journal editor willing to consider it for peer review. Community clinics that had been skeptical began to request training, not because they had abandoned scientific rigor, but because measured improvements demanded attention. If this story has stirred something in you, write a single word below in the comments. Yes, if you have experienced something inexplicable. No, if you have not. Maybe if you're undecided. Your single word helps others find solidarity and helps us decide which stories to investigate next. Some comments may be read in future episodes. Now prepare yourself, because what follows in the final section will show not only institutional responses, but the quieter, lasting changes in lives. In the months after the initial revelations, the town adjusted in ways both mundane and profound. At 1 month, the clinic log showed an increase in visits for chronic pain, but also an increase in reported satisfaction and decrease in repeat emergency visits for the same complaints. The clinic stocked supplements of saline, measuring tools, and simple informational flyers. Samuel's relationship with Mara entered a slow, guarded phase of reconstruction. She visited, read the research summaries, and joined a reconciliation session that lasted 3 hours, in which both partners spoke and both listened. At 3 months, local churches coordinated a common conference on spiritual care and medical ethics, attended by Dr. Ward and Pastor Lee, who presented their joint reflections to an audience of 200. The event did not resolve all doctrinal questions, but it opened a space for cross-disciplinary conversation. At 6 months, a pilot collaboration between Ridgeway Clinic and a community health center in a nearby town introduced the protocol into a supervised setting with independent observers. Preliminary outcome measures indicated improved wound healing metrics and subjective well-being across a small cohort. More importantly, individuals reported changes in social behavior. People were more willing to admit vulnerabilities and to seek reconciliation with estranged family members. The town's narrative had moved from an isolated oddity to a distributed practice of care that honored both evidence and awe. In conclusion, Samuel was not the same man who had driven home that October night. He had been learning to carry a new responsibility, to be the steward of a practice that required honesty, documentation, and humility. The broader implication of the events at Ridgeway suggests that certain teachings traditionally framed in sacred language might also be understood as embodied practices with reproducible effects. That does not make them less sacred. It situates them in a broader human vocation to heal through presence, science, and moral engagement. If this account moved you, subscribe to follow further investigations and share this video with someone who might benefit from a more expansive conversation about healing, intention, and community responsibility. Remember that the most radical change often begins when a single person decides to care in a focused, accountable way. Sometimes what we call miracle is the steady work of attention made systematic. And sometimes that work asks us not to choose between faith and science, but to translate one into the other with compassion as our method.